With the transplant, this is very important, and we need to have a full match transplant. So in this case, this is the patient, recipient, and this is the brother who is a full match. Okay. If you look at this, A, more or less the same. Okay. In 6 loci, they are 100% completely matched. Then that's the reason why we got this patient as a donor for this patient with acute myeloid leukemia. So again, as I have said, autologous stem cell transplant, high-dose chemotherapy is given to eradicate resistant or residual cells, then infuse the stem cells to guarantee the bone marrow recovery. So what do I mean? When we decide to do autologous stem cell transplantation, if you want to achieve, because this is given primarily for those patients with relapsed solid tumor, relapsed leukemia, or relapsed Hodgkin's lymphoma. If you want to ablate the tumor of these patients, what happens is you need to give toxic doses of your conditioning regimen or chemotherapy. The problem is if you give toxic doses of your conditioning regimen or intensive chemotherapy, you might ablate the bone marrow of the patient. So what happens is, if you ablate the bone marrow of the patient, then the patient will die coming from severe neutropenia because there's no way that this bone marrow will come back. Okay? So what happens is, before we do the intensive chemotherapy, in order to ablate the resistant tumor, we harvest the stem cell of the patient. I'll show it later on. Then, once we harvest, store it, then give the intensive chemotherapy, and infuse back the stem cell coming from the patient himself for the bone marrow of the patient to reconstitute and to prevent a devastating complication, mortality to the patient. Okay? Now, next is allogeneic stem cell transplant. The added advantage, of course, this is coming from a donor. The added advantage of graft versus leukemia of allogeneic stem cell transplant is the presence of graft versus leukemia. So what do I mean by graft versus leukemia? We should remember that the normal dictum in immunology in our body is, if you are exposed to a foreign protein, that foreign protein should be disposed of by your own body. So this is the reason why if you put something in your body, you will get a reaction. Nagkakaroon ng abscess, namumula, severe allergy, because that's a foreign body, and that is our natural protection. So what happens is, if you have a patient who has a leukemia, and the donor has no leukemia, once you expose this patient, that donor, to a cell with leukemia, the donor will recognize the abnormal cell. Sasabihin niya, hindi ito yung aking cell eh. Kasi wala akong leukemia, siya meron leukemia. This patient has an abnormal protein present in his system. So what happens is, the donor will recognize the abnormal leukemia proteins present in the patient. And this donor cell will try to reject the abnormal proteins present in this patient, and that's leukemia. So that's what we call as graft versus leukemia. So with graft versus leukemia, then you suppress the malignant clone of the patient, resulting the patient to a complete remission later on, and a possible cure. So, looking at the procedure for allogeneic stem cell transplant, so this is a sample schema wherein the patient is admitted 8 days prior to the procedure. Then, you give your conditioning regimen, be total body irradiation, okay? Then give your chemotherapy. This is to ablate the abnormal bone marrow of the patient. And after ablating the bone marrow of the patient, then the bone marrow will be empty and ready to receive the stem cells that this patient will receive coming from a donor. Okay, so this will empty the bone marrow, the abnormal bone marrow, and then rest day 1 before, and then start your cyclosporine IV. Cyclosporine is anti-rejection. So that once you give your stem cells, the patient will not reject the stem cells that you're giving. Then after that, you infuse by transfusion, not by surgery, because what happens is, and maybe your next question is, if we transfuse or infuse stem cells, bakit mapupunta dun sa bone marrow ng patient? Now, nasa labas lang naman yun, nagtatransfuse. Now, your stem cells has a homing effect. So when I say homing effect, even if you infuse them elsewhere in your body, they go home to the bone marrow. Why? Because the receptors of these stem cells are found inside your bone marrow. Parang ano yan? Pigeons. Okay? If you release them elsewhere, if they have a house or a home, then that pigeon will go home to where he belongs because they have what we call as a homing effect. Okay? Now what happens is, then you give methotrexate for anti-rejection and anti-graft versus host disease. Then what happens is, day 14 or day 15 after stem cell infusion, you will see that the count of the patient will return back to normal, and these are now the new stem cells that we have given to the patient. Okay, so this is a picture of a patient receiving total body irradiation, okay, before you infuse your stem cells as part of the conditioning regimen. Okay, so this is the infusion of the stem cells. These are the stem cells. This is the patient with acute myelogenous leukemia. Then you just infuse the stem cells, and these stem cells will have the homing effect and will go direct to the bone marrow of the patient. So this is a patient with acute myelogenous leukemia, smiling. Then these are the stem cells that we are infusing. Then these stem cells will go home. And it's a homing effect to the bone marrow of the patient for them to repopulate. So this is what I've told you. If you give your conditioning regimen here, then the counts will drop to a very low level, even almost zero. So usually, almost 1 week after you do your conditioning regimen, if you get a CBC, WBC 100, 50, 100, and you will be transfusing platelets almost every day. So this is the time that all the nurses will be very busy, because you will be transfusing platelets left and right, red cells left and right. The patient might be getting all the types of infection, bacterial, fungal, viral. So this is the time that we are all sleepless. The doctors and the nurses are all sleepless. Then what happens is, once the stem cell starts to engraft, usually day 14 after stem cell infusion, the WBC will go up, go up, go up, go up. And by day 28 average, then the count of the patient will recover. And that will be the time that what we call them usually as engraftment. Okay? So your stem cells have engrafted, so with the recovery of your cell count. How about autologous stem cell transplant? As I've said to you before, you harvest first before you do your conditioning regimen. Okay? Then you will be using, of course, again, medicine, cyclophosphamide to purge. The GCSF is given to mobilize the stem cell of the patient. Then, day 0, you do your harvest using the pheresis machine. Then, after the harvest, you store it. Okay? So this is your stem cell. After being harvested, peripherally, then you store it in a nitrogen freezer. Okay? So you store it, and this can be stored indefinitely until you decide when you give your conditioning regimen for the patient who will undergo stem cell transplantation. So this is it. Okay? So this is the preservative that we use, okay, for your autologous stem cells. Then what happens is, during the transplant itself, you admit the patient, give your conditioning regimen, total body irradiation, etoposide, high doses of chemotherapy. Okay? If you don't infuse your stem cells, don't expect that the bone marrow of the patient will come back. So what happens is definitely this patient will be dead after your intensive conditioning regimen. So what you will do is after your conditioning regimen, you infuse your stem cells coming from the patient himself. Then day 5, begin using GCSF to stimulate your white blood cells to come out. Then usually after day 10, we expect engraftment or recovery of your bone marrow, and the count will now be normal. The patient will be discharged from the hospital. So this is the transfusion of the stem cells when we do autologous stem cell transplant. Okay? So this is the patient after the conditioning regimen, thaw the autologous stem cell, then infuse it out to the patient. Okay? To rescue the patient from the devastating effect of severe bone marrow aplasia. So what are the indications of doing bone marrow transplant? For one, allogeneic transplant for malignant diseases, acute and chronic leukemias. Acute and chronic leukemias, especially in children, before we give treatment to these patients, we usually stratify them whether this patient belongs to a good risk or a high risk. Patients, especially in children, have an 80% chance of cure using chemotherapy. But we have 10 to 20% of cases wherein these patients have bad risk or high risk leukemias, wherein even if you give them intensive chemotherapy, most of them will relapse later on. Of course, we prognosticate them using white blood cells, cytogenetics, immunophenotype, and if you find them that they are poor risk or high risk leukemias in children, then of course, the option is to do stem cell transplantation to improve their survival. Patients with myelodysplastic syndrome, that's a pre-malignant aggressive disease. Patients who have lymphomas, who failed chemotherapy, or patients with multiple myeloma in adults, and patients with myeloproliferative diseases like chronic myelogenous leukemia or myelofibrosis, then you can do a stem cell transplantation of them. Allogeneic stem cell transplant for non-malignant cases, aplastic anemia or bone marrow failure. This is a patient whose bone marrow is almost empty, damaged from maybe infection, viruses, or chemotherapy, or exposed to insecticides or whatever chemicals. Then the patient will come to you with severe pancytopenia. Then you can do stem cell transplantation. Patients with thalassemia, this is congenital hemolytic disease. If you get a homozygous beta thalassemia because the mother is thalassemia, the father is thalassemia, then the offspring, as early as 4 to 6 months of life, will start blood transfusion. And that blood transfusion will be lifetime. So the only way for us to cure them is to do stem cell transplantation by infusing new stem cell, normal stem cells to these patients. Immune disorders, immune deficiency disorders, congenital immune deficiency disorders, they can be saved by doing your allogeneic stem cell transplant, or in patients with paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. How about autologous stem cell transplant? Autologous, we can do it in patients with multiple myeloma also, the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, lymphoma who are resistant to the standard chemotherapy, and you want to give massive doses of chemotherapy by killing the abnormal cells, then you can rescue them by your autologous stem cells. Patients with solid tumors, Hodgkin's diseases, solid tumors like neuroblastoma, Wilms tumor, brain tumor, these are the patients who might not be sensitive to the standard doses of chemotherapy. Then what you need is just harvest the stem cells of this patient and give massive doses of chemotherapy and rescue them with their own stem cells. Autoimmune diseases, multiple sclerosis. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of allogeneic hematopoietic stem cell transplant? So when we say allogeneic, this comes from a donor, okay? Now, advantages, lower relapse rate for those patients with allogeneic stem cell transplant. Why lower relapse rate? Because in allogeneic stem cell transplant, we have what we call as graft versus leukemia. As I have said, the donor will recognize the abnormal cells of the patient like leukemia as foreign, and these donor cells will attack the leukemia cells of the patient because they have foreign proteins. So this will help suppress down the abnormal leukemia cells of the patient. This will result in curability later on. Disadvantages: compatible donor, very hard to find. Because as I have said, only 1 out of 4 of your siblings is a full match. Okay? Now, but nowadays, of course, as I have said, we already have a haploidentical stem cell transplant. So we can easily now do a transplant, even if the donor is a mother or father. Graft versus host disease. What do I mean by graft versus host disease? This is more or less the same mechanism as graft versus leukemia. But in patients with graft versus host disease, sumobra naman. So what happens is, because of a disparity, especially if a mismatch, then what happens is the donor cells will recognize the patient as foreign. So they will not be only attacking the abnormal leukemia cells of the patient, but also the normal cells of the patient. So the donor cells will attack the liver, resulting to severe inflammation of the liver, and sometimes liver cirrhosis and liver failure later on. Or sometimes it might attack the gastrointestinal tract of the patient. So the patient will be developing diarrhea, voluminous diarrhea almost every day. Okay? So that's what we call as graft versus host disease. And of course, increased risk of infection, because these are patients who will be receiving immunosuppression. Okay? Immunosuppression is you want to suppress the immune system of the patient so that the donor stem cells will not be rejected. Then the risk of veno-occlusive disease, this is secondary to a damage to your liver sinusoids, resulting later on to the development of portal vein thrombosis, portal hypertension, etc. And of course, immunosuppression due to GVHD prophylaxis, the possibility of developing later on a secondary malignancy. Now, advantages of autologous stem cell transplant. The advantage is no need to look for a donor because the donor is the patient himself. No GVHD. Of course, no GVHD because the patient will not attack himself because he will be receiving his own stem cells. Lower risk of infection, okay? Because there is no immunosuppression. Disadvantages: the risk of relapse is very high because there's no graft versus leukemia, okay? No graft versus leukemia effect. And sometimes graft failure because of the effect of previous chemotherapy and radiotherapy that the patient had been subjected later on, before. So what are the complications that we are seeing in patients with undergoing EMT? Of course, nausea and vomiting because of the conditioning regimen, but this is not a concern nowadays because we have good antiemetics that will prevent this complication. Nutrition, because sometimes the patient will not be eating for a prolonged period of time after chemotherapy, and the patient will be developing all the mucositis, the mouth sores, the diarrhea. Then diarrhea coming from infection, renal complications because of electrolyte imbalance and dehydration, veno-occlusive disease of the liver, this is what we call as VOD, resulting to portal hypertension because of damage from the effect of your conditioning regimen, pancytopenia, then graft rejection, acute graft versus host disease. You can develop rashes and pulmonary complications like your BOOP, and sometimes death if we are not careful with the patient. So, how about the survival for these patients? Okay, looking at this, okay, for identical matched sibling allogeneic stem cell transplant, the 5-year disease-free survival for patients with AML or ANLL in first remission is 55 to 70%. If you give chemotherapy, the chance of survival is between 40 to 50%. ALL, first or second remission, 30 to 50%. Chronic myelogenous leukemia, 60 to 80%. Lymphoma, who had failure after first-line therapy, 15 to 40%. Aplastic anemia, who are untransfused, 85 to 90%. Aplastic anemia, who are transfused, 50 to 70%. And patients with thalassemia major, this is I've told you before, the patient receiving blood transfusion from time to time monthly, the survival, a 5-year event-free survival is at 70 to 85%. How about autologous stem cell transplant? Lymphoma, 30 to 60%, neuroblastoma, 45 to 50, Ewing sarcoma, 25 to 30, rhabdomyosarcoma, Wilms tumor, and brain tumor, 50. Before the advent of autologous stem cell transplant, the survival for these patients, especially with advanced disease, lymphoma, neuroblastoma, Ewing's, rhabdomyosarcoma, Wilms, and brain tumor, especially those who were metastatic disease, the survival is almost zero. So looking at this, probability of leukemia-free survival after transplantation, okay? If you look at this, they have three curves, okay? Transplant while patient is in first complete remission, transplant while patient is in second complete remission, and transplant performed when the patient is not in remission. Okay? So if you look at this, patients who are high risk, meaning patients who are having all the poor risk parameters that belongs to the 20% not curable with plain chemotherapy. If you do your transplant after first complete remission, so meaning you give your chemotherapy and the bone marrow is normal and the patient is in complete remission, and subject this patient to a transplant, the chance of cure is at almost 60%. If you do your transplant, okay, when the patient is in second complete remission, so meaning you give your chemotherapy, the patient went into complete remission, again, the patient went to do another relapse, and you subject this patient to transplant, the chance of cure is low at 40%. If you do your transplant in a patient who is not in remission, so meaning the bone marrow is abnormal, ipilitin mo, you do your transplant, then the chance of survival, and that's 5-year survival, is between 10 to 20%. It's very low. So therefore, what is very important is, if you decide to do a transplant in your high-risk patients with poor prognosis, timing is very important. And as soon as possible, after the patient goes into complete remission, first see, then you subject this patient to stem cell transplantation. So prophylaxis and supportive care for stem cell transplant is very important. All the patients, when they are subjected to transplant because of the conditioning regimen, almost all of them will develop mucositis. So these are all the solutions that we can use to minimize the discomfort coming from chemotherapy. Recombinant hematopoietic growth factors, your GCSF, your erythropoietin, thrombopoietin, we can use it to effect early recovery of your bone marrow. Then prophylaxis against pneumocystis bacteria. This is the most common bacteria that we encounter for those patients who are immunocompromised. That's why we are giving cotrimoxazole to these patients. Prophylaxis against fungal infections. Prophylaxis against viral infection, herpes and CMV. And the giving of IVIG to help prevent infection. And of course, what is very important is to build up the nutrition of these patients who are subjected to stem cell transplantation. So why is venous access very important? So this is what is very important to us. Because we want to have a central line, and for our patients with stem cell transplant, we usually insert a triple lumen catheter. Okay? Why triple lumen? Because you can use them for high-dose chemotherapy. You can use them when we infuse the stem cell after TBI or high-dose chemotherapy. Then, of course, you will be getting blood samples almost every day. And you don't want to extract blood coming from the peripheral blood almost every day to this patient. That's really a discomfort to the patient and torture. Then fluid and electrolyte replacement, nutritional support, marrow support with red cells and platelet transfusion, especially during the first 2 weeks wherein you will be transfusing almost every day. Sabay-sabay yan. Okay? Do your blood test, correct your electrolytes, give your nutritional support, and give your transfusion support. And most of these patients will be getting infection, so you give your antimicrobial therapy. So what happens is if you only have a single line, then you will not be finished all the blood and the electrolyte and the antibiotics that you need to give to the patient. So that's why we will be using a triple lumen catheter for these patients. And of course, support and treatment to prevent the possibility of having GVHD, and that is your immunoprophylaxis. Immuno Suppression. So again, we will be having, of course, if you have a central line, then we will be having all these complications. So that's why, as much as possible, we want the nurses to be very particular to the care of our venous access. Okay, infection, thrombosis, superior vena cava perforation, etc., etc. So these are all the complications that we will be seeing if you have a central venous access. And of course, if you will not be very careful, this could be a possible source of morbidity and mortality to our patients who underwent stem cell transplantation. So how about our Philippine bone marrow transplant experience? Okay? Now, unfortunately, this is not updated. 2012, we have 2 teams here. Then, as of December 31, 2012, this is our total transplant. 2012, we are now 2020, and definitely the numbers have doubled. So these are the different diseases: AML, CML, myelodysplastic syndrome, aplastic anemia, Fanconi's anemia, skins, etc., etc. Okay. So these are the patients. So this is our transplant data at St. Louis Medical Center. So this is not updated, and the last patient was entered 2013. So almost 6 or 7 years ago. So we had 56 patients, 58 stem cell transplants because the 2 other patients had a retransplant. So for 32 for the sex, 32 were males, 24 were females. The type of transplant, the most common is allogeneic stem cell transplant, and most of them are matched sibling donor, meaning galing sa kapatid. Okay? We only have 2 mismatch related and 1 cord stem cell. Autologous, we had 9. A total number of transplants that we had for pediatric patients, 24, and adults, 32. But this was 2013. So these are the different diseases that we transplanted. Most common, of course, is leukemia, AML, ALL, biphenotypic leukemia, then myelodysplastic syndrome, etc., etc. Autologous stem cell transplant, myeloma, AML, Hodgkin's disease. So looking at the overall survival, when we lump them, allogeneic, it's 51%, 5-year survival. Mortality, 49%. And the most common cause of mortality was relapse. Okay? The next, infection, graft failure, and graft versus host disease. Overall survival for autologous stem cell transplant, 44%. So these are the acute leukemia data that we had. We had AML patients and ALL and biphenotypic transplanted after first complete remission. Of course, these are all high risk, bad type of leukemia. And these are the patients who were transplanted beyond first complete remission. So if you look at the overall survival, median follow-up of 64 months, the overall survival was 53%. But looking at the disease status, if you do your transplant after first complete remission, for those patients who are high risk, the 5-year event-free survival is very high at 80%. But if you do your transplant beyond first CR, then the 5-year event-free survival is only 14%. So the message is, if you want to do transplant in your patient, what is very important is patient selection. If you have a high-risk patient, then plan immediately for a transplant, because by subjecting them to a transplantation later on with multiple relapses, the chance of survival is very, very poor and low. So these are the AML patients. So nowadays, we have what we call as haploidentical stem cell transplant. So as I have said, haploidentical stem cell transplant, we are getting the donor from the father or the mother. Okay? We know that the mother is a 50% match, the father is a 50% match. So we already have a donor, ready donor. Unlike before, wherein we will be looking a full match donor coming from the sibling. So from there on, nakaka-decide ka na agad, go to transplant, and we will be using a haploidentical donor. So this is the patient with myelodysplastic syndrome. Then we are using the stem cell coming from the father. And this patient was transplanted 6 years ago, and this is now graduating from high school with a myelodysplastic syndrome. A myelodysplastic syndrome is a deadly disease, and if you don't do a transplant, definitely this patient will be dead. So again, same mechanism. For patients with haploidentical transplant, there's a conditioning regimen, stem cell infusion, then you have to give your post-infusion cyclophosphamide and your Immuno Suppression. Same mechanism. So this is the pharesis machine that we are using for haplo. Again, same mechanism. That's differential centrifugation, wherein we get the stem cell of the parent, mother or father, then return back the unnecessary cells to the donor. Okay. So what are the challenges that we have in transplant? Number one, of course, you cannot avoid the cost. But if you compare our transplant here in the Philippines than abroad, in the United States, if you do a transplant, the minimum amount is $500,000 US dollars to $1 million US dollars. So that's, if you have complications, you can go as high as $1 million US dollars. So that's 54 million pesos. Okay? If you go to Thailand or Singapore transplant is 15 million pesos. In Thailand, it's 6 to 7 billion pesos. But in the Philippines, we had a patient we transplanted, and the cost is between 1.5 to 1.6 million. If you add up the chemotherapeutic cost that you gave to the patient, like for example, if you have a high-risk patient and subject them to intensive chemotherapy, most of these patients will stay in the hospital indefinitely. If you add up the cost, kulang ang 1.6 million, diba? But if you subject them to a transplant direct, then this could be more or less makakatipid. Okay? Sino ang nakakita dito na patients receiving intensive chemotherapy, especially AML? How many of them are given intensive chemotherapy and needs to stay in the hospital for 1 month? And these patients are subjected to chemotherapy once a month for a minimum of 6 months. 6 months, they stay in the hospital. If you stay in the hospital with all the complications coming from chemotherapy, then kulang ang 1 million per cycle. Okay? So that's for AML, of course. AML is different. Then lack of medication for complications. Fortunately, we all have almost all the medicines here. The quality of medical care, this is our problem. Exodus of nurses. Because when we train nurses, in 2 to 3 years, most of them are in Singapore, in London, in the United States, with all their faces in the Facebook. Okay, so that's the reason why we will be training them again and again, So every 2 to 3 years, we have a new set of nurses because definitely the nurses that we train are all gone abroad. No formal training in transplantation in our country because, as I have said, we have limited. If you want to form a transplant unit, really, then you need funding. Okay? Because you will be getting more patients, you need more funds. Then, of course, funding is very important. So that's why, even if we have hundreds of patients, you need thousands of patients so that we can really get a good feel of what transplantation is all about. Then, lack of awareness regarding the indication and appropriate timing of transplantation. Then, we have, of course, we have doctors here. We subject the patient to all types of chemotherapy. Pag naubos na yung pasyente, okay, magpa-transplant na kayo. And of course, these are not patients who are good candidates for transplant because most of them have multiple relapses. And of course, we don't have a bone marrow bank. We don't have suitable donors because, as I have said, if we do allogeneic stem cell transplantation, then you need really good match coming from a sibling. But of course, nowadays, we are now developing with our haploidentical stem cell transplant, and it's more easier to get donors nowadays compared before. So this is our patient who had acute myelogenous leukemia. She's now working at leukemia when she was 10 years old. Is this really the case? Where the patient cannot go out? Parang bago. Diba, ang ating iniisip is if you are subjected to stem cell transplantation, you are not allowed to go out for years. Not nowadays. Because after 100 days, if the patient is fully grafted and the count is recovered, then she can start going out and working back. How about the cost? As I have said, this is the patient before. When the patient was presented with a bill, the patient had a heart attack. So the patient didn't die from leukemia, but the patient died from bone marrow transplantation, not from the disease, but from the cost. Biro lang yan. So as I have said, we have tried to lower down the cost of transplant nowadays, and the average is 1.5 to 2 million. So this is our first transplant patient, Nicole. She was 7 years old when she had acute myelogenous leukemia, high risk. She's now working in one of the companies here in Makati. A very, very beautiful lady. Thank you very much for your attention.